We're going to answer some burning questions in the community on this week's podcast. First thing, should you be stocking up on your compound injectable GLP-1 medications? Second, when are we going to get the Zepbound QuickPens from LillyDirect? And are they going to get rid of that pesky 45-day requirement? And we even got some news on Retatrutide. We're going to get into all that on this week's episode of the Weekly Dose Podcast. Let's do it.
Welcome to the On the Pen podcast with your host, Dave Knapp.
Welcome back to the Weekly Dose Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Knapp, man on the Manjaro. That's why I'm here. You are on the pen. Wegovy, Saxenda, Victoza, Trulicity, Manjaro, Zepbound, Compound. That's what we talk about each and every week here as we endeavor to give you information that empowers you to have better conversations with your doctor, hopefully better health outcomes. That's the goal. So welcome back. If you find this video helpful, please take a moment, hit the thumbs up button, hit the hype button below, hit subscribe. And if you're listening on the podcast, a 5-star rating and review does wonders to train the little algorithm. That's little Al Gore in the sky, training all the computers to deliver you the content that you love the most. So train that little Al Gore. So welcome back. We had a busy week last week that started with an Eli Lilly earnings call. And ultimately, there was a few things that we learned in that earnings call that I think were really game changers. Honestly, it was one of the most interesting earnings calls that I have had the pleasure of covering in the last 4 years that I've been covering Eli Lilly earnings calls. And that is not an understatement. It was a fantastic earnings call. And so I want to go over just a few things. We covered this full thing over at our Substack. So obesity.news will take you there. You can go to the earnings call recap. The video's embedded there. We did like a nice video recap like we always do. But what we learned, I think that is most pertinent for the community at this moment is that Retatrutide finally has a clear timeline. We've always been sort of guessing, Dave, when's Retatrutide coming out? No, for many of you in the gray market world, you're already using it. In fact, one of the interesting things I saw this weekend is there are over 200,000 people, or nearly 200,000 people in the Retatrutide forum over on Reddit. But for the first time, Lilly spoke about the actual timeline of sequencing for the submittals. So we learned that there are 6. I mean, we knew this, but I hadn't put this together in my head. There are 6 phase 3 readouts coming in 2026 for Retatrutide alone. And Lilly does plan to submit Retatrutide in 2026 for obesity, osteoarthritis, and sleep apnea, obstructive sleep apnea. So those 3 indications will be submitted this year, which means by the beginning to middle of 2027, we should have Retatrutide. Super exciting. And that's the clearest signal that we've seen yet on the timeline of Retatrutide. So I thought that that was a huge deal. But one of the things that happened in this earnings call is that Lilly was really continuing to hammer home that Retatrutide will be not a replacement for Zepbound. It's an escalation therapy. It's for folks with more advanced metabolic disease, and I'm certain that it will be priced accordingly. Now, on the topic of GLP-1 GIPs, Brinipetide was a peptide that we introduced you to after the last earnings call. It's the new generation GLP GIP. If that sounds familiar, that's because that's what is in Manjaro and Zepbound, GLP GIP. But we've long known on the pen. In fact, one of the things I always say is like, semaglutide, a straight GLP-1 receptor agonist, feels like it works in your gut more than anything. You feel that physical fullness, like a brick in your stomach. Where Tirzepatide, if I had to explain my experience, works more like a stealthy ninja. It just turns off the thinking about food. And so to me, it's always been reasonable to believe that Tirzepatide's working in the brain differently than straight GLP-1 does. We've actually seen that in some interesting trials that we've covered here where they hooked folks up to brain scanners and then showed them highly palatable food. They showed them the highly palatable food before they had any medication. They showed the highly palatable food when they were on a GLP-1 and then on Tirzepatide with a GLP-1 GIP. And it was very noticeable in the GLP GIP Tirzepatide group. All of the areas that the brain lit up in response to the satiated, highly palatable foods before the medicine were shut off when they took Tirzepatide. So all that's a long way around the block to say it works in the brain. And it works in the brain so much so that Lilly confirmed that there are a whole host of clinical trials going to start in Brinipetide, the new GLP-1 GIP, and none of them were for obesity and none of them were for diabetes. They were all neurological disorders. We learned that there is a phase 3 trial starting for Brinipetide in 2026 in alcohol use disorder. We learned that there's going to be trials starting in tobacco and bipolar disorder and major depressive disorders. So this is not a marginal expansion of GLP GIP. This is a move from incretin biology being used to modulate blood sugar and appetite to completely just addressing those reward pathways, mood regulation, and the central nervous system. So if you doubted that these things are working in the brain, the whole new advent of GLP GIP from Eli Lilly is in the neurological sector, and that will be very interesting to follow. Now, the third thing that I thought was really interesting here was that we learned that there's a phase 3 clinical trial starting for Tirzepatide and type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetics rejoice. There are so many of you in the On the Pen community. I mean, it's a small number compared to everybody else, but small and mighty amount of folks that have type 1 diabetes and are benefiting from the use of Tirzepatide. Now it will be clinically validated in a phase 3 trial that is ongoing currently, testing Zepbound or Mounjaro in Tirzepatide in type 1 diabetes, which is really exciting because it may open the door for adjunct metabolic support with the incretin class of medications for type 1 diabetes. So this is meaningful, and I'm really excited to share that as we get more data on that. But what everybody's been asking me about ever since we broke the news, the first on the internet to break the news about Zepbound QuickPens being approved, including the multi-dose vials as well. We didn't learn anything about the multi-dose vials on the earnings call, but we did learn that Lilly was confirming that the QuickPens are actually going to be approved or have been approved and will launch in the coming days. So it's February 10th today. So maybe by the end of the month. I mean, that's how I take days to mean. So hopefully by the end of the month. And one of the things that we learned is that the plan was in the spring to drop the 45-day requirement. That seemed to be in step with when around the time they plan to launch the QuickPens. So will that pesky 45-day requirement go away? That is what we believe is going to happen when these launch. So we will need you to stay tuned. Make sure you hit subscribe, like, save, share, train the algorithm. So that you can stay on top of that news when it comes out. But hopefully they get rid of that 45-day refill requirement with the launch of the QuickPens, which is coming in the coming days. Those are Lilly's words. So that was the main takeaways, I think, for the community in terms of the Eli Lilly earnings call. And I think that those are going to be really exciting developments to watch. It was like I said, one of the most interesting earnings calls that I have had the chance to follow, and that is not an understatement at all. I was really, really excited after that call. And again, you can check that out at obesity.news where we did the full rundown. Now, let's get into this idea of stocking up on compounds because the news that's happened over the last week since the earnings call. So the earnings call happened on Wednesday. Now let's talk about what happened on Thursday. So the Novo Nordisk earnings call also happened to have taken place on Thursday or on Wednesday. And on Thursday, right after we learned that Novo Nordisk was downgrading their sales forecast for the year, we learned that the pill launch was actually far and above, I think, what anybody expected it was going to be. It was absolutely astounding to see that 170,000 prescriptions for the pill have already been written, and that most of those prescriptions are for the starter dose. So it's not even cannibalizing injections right now. It is mostly new to GLP-1 or new to therapy patients, which is really exciting for Novo Nordisk if you're an investor long term. Not so exciting about the downgrading of the stock for the year, but really exciting news, right? And so they announced this huge launch for the pill. The next day, Hims and Hers comes out and says, "Hey, we got the same thing for $50 a month." Okay, so they launch a pill, and not only do they launch the pill, but they launch it with marketing that said it's the same active ingredient as Wegovy, as the Wegovy pill, but we've got, instead of $149 to start, we've got it for $50, which of course was going to prompt a massive response for two reasons, right? For the first reason is you can't say it has the same active ingredient as Wegovy. The FDA says you can't say that. In fact, they sent letters to Hims and Hers, told them to stop that back in the fall of 2025. They never did. Not with any of their advertising did they stop saying same active ingredient as Wegovy. But when they launched this pill the day after, they said it again. And not only that, but we've learned for a long time here that the pills are a real weird area, right? Prior to there being a branded option on the market, they did offer, an option for patients who didn't want to use the injectable. You want to try these, untested, unproven ways of taking a GLP-1. You can try, like these sublingual drops or whatever. Probably not going to be the most effective thing in the world, but hey, if you don't want to take the shot, can't take the shot, whatever, it's an option. Well, now the pills are here, and the pills that Novo makes have been proven to be almost as effective as the Wegovy injections. But they paid $2 billion for a technology that allows that semaglutide to survive your stomach acid so that just 1% of the pill gets absorbed. So for me, I take a 25 milligram pill once a day, and I get 1% of that absorbed into my body. 1% of that 25 milligram. So you're taking like 70 times the active pharmaceutical ingredient per week as you are in the once weekly injection. So that should give you some framework of idea of how difficult it would be to compound a medication that has similar efficacy. When you say you have the same active ingredient, people don't understand that perhaps the technology that you're using to make it orally bioavailable isn't a one-for-one swap. And so, of course, the FDA freaked out. We saw tweets that day from Dr. Marty Makary, who runs the FDA. We saw senators getting into the fray, considering submitting a complaint to the Department of Justice. I mean, it got intense really quick, and it culminated with a letter that the FDA ended up putting out on Friday. Now, this was while I was at an Obesity Action Coalition event. If you don't know the OAC, they are one of the main reasons that we are talking about obesity as a disease and talking about medications that treat it. No one has worked harder to make sure that people get access to care, quality care, and care that treats people with the dignity that they deserve. And we were just building on that conversation while I was down there. And so if you haven't checked out the Obesity Action Coalition, check out otplinks.com and learn more about them. They're great. But I got this right in the middle of that, this letter that the FDA put out. And this is where the big question about should we stock up on compounds comes from, because in this letter, Marty Makary sends this letter out for immediate release. It says, today, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration is announcing its intent to take decisive steps to restrict GLP-1 active pharmaceutical ingredient APIs intended for use in non-FDA approved compounded drugs that are being mass marketed by companies, including Hims and Hers and other compounding pharmacies, as similar alternatives to FDA approved drugs. These actions are aimed to safeguard consumers from drugs for which the FDA cannot verify quality, safety, or efficacy. We take seriously any potential violations of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. It goes on to talk about the marketing. FDA also takes steps to combat misleading direct-to-consumer advertising and marketing following warning letters that were sent in the fall of 2025, which we just alluded to. In promotional materials, companies cannot claim that non-FDA approved compounded products are generic versions or the same as drugs approved by the FDA. They also cannot compound drugs they also cannot state that compounded drugs use the same active ingredient as the FDA approved drugs. It goes on. But essentially, this is a direct response to what they had heard in the advertising just the day before from Hims and Hers. So they almost were obligated to say something at that point, because the marketing around the Hims and Hers pill was so egregious. It would have been one thing if they were just goading Novo Nordisk, like they've had their public spats and probably tried to work a deal to get the branded pill. Who knows? There are a lot of people surmising that was trying to take place behind the scenes over on Twitter. But I digress. The FDA almost had to say something, because if a pill is marketing itself as the same thing for $50, it's undermining the patent. And it's essentially being disingenuous to the fact that there's a $2 billion technology involved in the testing of that pill that allowed it to come to market that is definitely not being used in the branded version, or if it is, probably raises other concerns. So the FDA almost had to say something, right? The question is whether or not that crackdown means compounds across the board. And that's really where the big question lies. And so that's where I want to read at least a part of a letter that came out today from the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding. Mr. Scott Bruner, who's been on the Pen podcast before, put out a statement for the press addressed to Commissioner Marty Makary of the FDA, basically taking umbrage with the letter that we just read. Now, we did a live stream all about this yesterday. We did a one on Friday. So if you want to get the full breadth of like what's going on here, I strongly recommend you go back and watch those to just get a feel for what exactly the landscape is and all the nitty-gritty details. But I just want to highlight a few things, and you'll be able to read the full letter from the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding at otplinks.com. We'll put it up there for you to read. Again, that's otplinks.com. But I just want to touch on a couple things. First of all, they get into the prescriber judgment and patient-specific care. Again, kind of getting to the point where the judge in the Lilly lawsuit against Willow last week did, saying a prescription comes from a provider. A doctor, a prescriber is prescribing the compound. The pharmacy is just making it. And so essentially that statement by the FDA, according to the APC here, is interfering with medical judgment, not compounding. And as it goes on, Mr. Bruner gets into the point that the use of API is a component of an FDA-approved drug, sort of taking umbrage with the fact that the FDA said you can't call it the same active ingredient. They're saying, according to the FDA's framework on how you have to source API for compounded GLP-1s, essentially it is the same, although they do agree that you shouldn't be making any claims about FDA approval or clinical trials because it's not the FDA approved version of the medication, although it does use the same active ingredient, is the argument that they're making there. And so it goes on, and I think rightfully so, to highlight the green list that the FDA created last fall in an attempt to basically create a list of saying, these are the good vendors. These are the vendors that you can use that we've vetted that are going to be good for sourcing API for your GLP-1s. And so they talk about the green list and how really this is double speak from the FDA. If you're saying that there's, bad versions of API coming into the country while at the same time creating a green list that says these are good, it's incongruent. Furthermore, they go on to make the statement, and I think this has sort of been the ongoing frustration, that the enforcement action that the FDA seems to be loudest about and that the pharmaceutical companies seem to be most pissed about are the compounded versions and not the gray markets. The gray markets, peptides, there's such a wide variety of the quality of them. There's everything from stateside manufactured gray market medications that come with, endotoxin reports and quality and sterility reports, all the way to versions that are smuggled over in Temu shipments and dog food. So it's a wide variety, yet it seems like the good actors that are operating within the regulatory framework that we've created at the state level and with the 503Bs at the federal level are the ones that are targeted for enforcement. Like I agree, and I think the APC agrees, the bad actors should be weeded out. But why does it seem like the first move is always to thwart what's maybe arguably more safe for patients, or at least has more regulatory framework around it? Seems wild, right? And that was sort of the issue that we took with some of the legislation that we've seen pop up against compound pharmacies as well. Super frustrating. I'm not arguing that there shouldn't be more framework around compounding in terms of the fact that we're seeing compounding being done on a scale that we've never seen it done before. Millions and millions and millions of people on injectable medications. Yeah, I don't think that it was necessarily created for this. So some additional framework would probably be good for patient safety and efficacy, and just knowing that what you're spending your money on is what you're getting. Because at the end of the day, compounds still aren't cheap. I mean, that's in some cases they're barely cheaper than what your LillyDirect or NovoCare prices are. So if people are still paying a premium for compounds, they ought to know that they're safe, that they're sterile, that they're what they're paying for. And so some framework around that, it would not be a terrible thing altogether. But I think the APC's frustration is why are you pointing this enforcement stuff at us when this stuff is still going on? It's just going to push more people to that. And I think that's been the argument that we've made for like 3 or 4 years here on the pen when we saw that this stuff would all be happening one day down the line. So the APC put a statement out. If you want to read that full statement, you go to OTP links and check that out. But I'm in full agreement with what the APC put out today. I think it's wholly reasonable that the FDA slow enforcement. And that was the main thing, the main gist of this letter is that the APC saying, can you slow down your enforcement? And can we just take a beat and talk here about this? Because we see some inconsistencies in the FDA's language. And we don't want you to be just enforcing this stuff willy-nilly without a clear understanding of what's going on. And so the APC asking the FDA to slow down their enforcement seems to me that the APC, the ones who make your compounds, these are the ones that make your compounds, are asking the FDA to please slow down on your enforcement. And so if the ones that are asking or the ones that are making the compounds are saying, please slow down, I think that's reason to say, you need to be making other plans with your doctor about what you're going to do for a continuity of care. If something happens to your compounded medication access, you need to be talking to your doctor about that today. My own personally held belief here is that this response to the FDA isn't a attempt to shut down compounding altogether. I don't think that's what's happening here. In fact, when you look in the broader perspective of what's happening, the one thing we didn't know when this letter was launched on Friday is that Novo Nordisk just 2 days before received their own letter from the FDA. This is highlighted from Madison Moeller over at Bloomberg, so it's a good catch on her part. Novo Nordisk received a letter on their commercials for the Wegovy pill, taking umbrage with the fact that they were essentially saying things that could lead patients to believe that the pills were better than the injections. And so essentially said, hey, this means that the sale of your Wegovy pill it's being mismarketed, misbranded. And so they got a similar letter from the FDA. So I think instead of this being a heavy-handed response to compounding, I think it was maybe a little bit more even-handed. They say we're going to slap compounders on the wrist and we're going to slap Novo on the wrist because we've got to rein in the marketing on both sides. And so I think that's congruent with other statements the FDA has made and concerns the FDA has made about the marketing, mass marketing of medical interventions like prescription drugs in general. And so my personal held belief is that nothing's going to happen here in terms of like massive overnight taking away of your compounds. But there is concern by the trade organization that represents the very people that make these in terms of asking the FDA to slow down their enforcement. So could there be some interruption? Potentially. We'll just have to continue to follow this closely, which is another reason to make sure that you hit the subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening to the podcast, make sure you download and give it a 5-star rating and review to train the algorithm along the way. So that is what we have. Again, we did a live stream on this topic and more yesterday that's really worth going back and checking out if you just go to my GLP-1 live playlist on YouTube. The other thing that happened, so this takes us essentially through the weekend where we ultimately did have the Super Bowl. We had commercials from Roe and Hims and Hers. We had a crazy commercial with I can't remember whether it was Health and Human Services that put out this fat shaming video with it was Mike Tyson calling people pudgy. I can't tell whether you're saying pudgy or fudgy or whatever, but just, ultimately the point of the video, I guess, was to say we got to do something about our food supply. But in the process, somehow came off to me to be a fat shaming video, which was wild to me. But I guess, this is the world we live in. But we saw such a focus at the Super Bowl on weight. Again, we saw Serena and Roe and her use of GLP-1s. We saw like a 2-minute commercial on the Wegovy pill from Novo Nordisk. We saw a Hims and Hers commercial. We saw so much that revolved around food and weight and medication. And it's just indicative of the times that we live in an industry that is absolutely going bonkers because the disease and problem of obesity is so massive. So it's an exciting time to be covering this because it's in the forefront, but it's never been more important for creators like me to be cognizant of the fact that bias and stigma still exist because people fail to understand and recognize that obesity is a chronic relapsing disease worthy of medical treatment. And so that's what we were spending time even just this past week down in New Orleans doing. So that was a special time, and I think timely, given how in the limelight this conversation is. So if you're new to this conversation, welcome. I know there's many people coming in every day who are just starting a GLP-1, and I think that you're going to find the information that we share here helpful and beneficial. The last thing that I want to gloss over again is a topic that we covered yesterday, but in the middle of all this, it took us to Monday, where there was a lawsuit filed against Hims and Hers by Novo Nordisk. And we have seen this 100 times plus from Novo Nordisk, where they file lawsuits against compounders or telehealth companies, or they send cease and desist letters, hundreds, maybe thousands with the cease and desist letters by now. But this one's different. Novo Nordisk has sued Hims and Hers over patent infringement. And you may say, well, what's the significance of that? Well, my own personally held belief on all this is a fight compounders have wanted for a long time, because there is a segment of the compounding industry that believes that peptides do not belong under patent lock and key by pharmaceutical companies. Reason being, at least their argument is that these specific peptides are mimicking naturally occurring hormones. So semaglutide is a GLP-1 receptor analog, meaning that it's chemically, mimics structurally our natural endogenous GLP-1. The thing that makes the peptide special or unique is that it's been designed to have a half-life that lasts 7 days in your body, whereas your natural endogenous GLP-1 lasts just a few minutes. So I sort of take umbrage that there's no sort of innovation that takes place, because then you look at Tirzepatide. Tirzepatide mimics GLP-1 and GIP, but it does it in one molecule. And it has a binding affinity that has gives the medication a 5-day half-life. So anyways, I think that this is a fight that compounders have wanted, because I think that they have wanted to long challenge the validity of these patents in court. And I also believe that Hims and Hers has been spending the last couple of years, or at least the last year, definitely setting themselves up as, sort of the answer to the broken medical system. And so I think this really sets them up to be a champion of the patients who want that reform and change. And so one may argue that this is a battle that they wanted. But I think you can also argue that this is not a fight that the drug companies wanted. The drug companies have been very quick to defend their trademarks, but they have been very slow to defend their patents. And I believe that it was sort of a chess move by Hims and Hers to be as egregious as they were with the launch of the pill, because Novo is now in a position where they have publicly stated that they have lost an exorbitant amount of money to compounding. Then they, on Wednesday, announced what a boon the pill has been to their business, even despite having to downgrade their sales forecast for the year because they're facing headwinds of losing their patents in other countries. I really think that this put Novo in a position where they had to sue to defend their patent, because otherwise, to not do so in the face of Novo launching a $50 version of what they're charging $150 for, and sort of fly in the tailwinds of the success of the Wegovy pill, there would have been an investor revolt on the Novo Nordisk side. And they already ousted their CEO once over sort of, I believe, how proliferated the semaglutide compounds were allowed to get in the first place without major led lawsuits like over the patent like this one. So that's my own personal take on it. It's going to be very interesting to watch develop and to see how this comes out. At the end of the day, my hope is that whatever the outcome is, that future innovation of these drugs is not stalled or thwarted in any way, because I love compounds. I love the accessibility to compounds. I love the backstop that the compound industry provides to our healthcare system. But I also love the innovation that we do in this country. I love that we have these molecules in the first place. And the folks like me who are struggling with severe metabolic disease need better treatments. And we need the innovation of the pharmaceutical companies. We need government funding to help to fund innovation in this space. The compounders aren't the ones coming up with the chemicals and the molecules that are treating the disease. They're helping to meet the demand for it, but they're certainly not creating the actual molecules. And so we need both. We need a thriving pharmaceutical industry that is incentivized to make medication that help to treat the chronic disease of obesity and the chronic diseases that plague this country across the board. But we also need compound pharmacies to help meet patient need. So there has to be a balance here. And I hope that we strike a balance. And if you want to learn more about what I have to say on this topic, you should go back and really check out yesterday's live, where I spent a lot of time on this topic. But I really hope that you enjoyed the podcast today. So much going on. We're going to continue to cover this as all of this unfolds over the next days, weeks, and months. This specific lawsuit could take years to be hashed out in court, if ever, if it's not just, if they don't make some agreement ahead of time, if they don't settle. So we'll have to see. We'll cover it closely. We will hear it on the pen. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being the best part of the channel. We have got an excellent interview airing on Friday with Dr. Rachel Goldman, one of Oprah's panelists on her GLP-1 and obesity special. So I got the chance to sit down with Dr. Rachel, got actually the chance to meet her in person in New Orleans as well. But you're not going to want to miss that one. So make sure you subscribe to the channel, like, save, share, send this to a friend, and we will catch you on the next one.